Okay, we gathered enough, sung them in. Sung them in. Okay, so Hebrews. Right now we're looking at logos and law. Logos and law. So the two words of the day. Well, we've had these words before, but I just can't resist them when we run across them. Poneros. This is A here. A.
There's a word collection.
Poneros, which the word we get pornography from comes from poneros. But that's not exactly where the Greek word comes from per se, okay? Poneros means, it means specifically hurtful. Hurtful. And if you look at what it says here, it says, i.e. evil. Figuratively, calamitous, or, calamity, calamity-wise. Also ill, diseased, especially morally, culpable, derelict, vicious, fetchinoris. That means like sexually bad. Neuter, mischief, malice, guilt, masculine, the devil. Plural, sinners. Okay, we got a long way from hurtful. So what does the word really mean? Well, the basis of the word is from pino, to toil for daily substance, starving, toil. All right, well, we just got this just flashed a flashlight, or a spotlight, if you like, into culture, the Greek culture. So, I'm not going to say the Greeks viewed it exactly this way, but what do you think the Greeks thought about working for your food?
Didn't look forward to it.
Didn't look forward to it. That's a good way of putting it. I'm not going to say they saw it was evil or bad or anything like that. But look what they did with this word. The word comes from, porneros comes from the idea of toiling for your daily substance. So, subsistence. So the average person probably didn't. What? The average person in the, okay, when you read about Socrates and Plato and all these guys, right?
They had a lot of extra time on their hands.
They had a lot of extra time on their hands, exactly, and that's why they were the way they were, right? So we're talking about Rockefellers here, or Kennedys, or, we're talking about the guys, they were the average people, but in their average view, all right, we really have a real strange view here, right? You guys all live like kings. You know that? You live better than kings. You have better health, better food, better places to live. If you were living in a drafty castle in the Middle Ages compared to today, you'd say, give me my camping gear. Because you'd be freezing, you'd have terrible food, you'd have stuff in your food, and you'd wonder where the lice came from. So, you need something, right? And you say, where's my lice, anti-lice stuff? Because we need a sheep dip. The world before the 20th century, actually the world before the 20th century was not a happy place. Remember Tua Laus, written by Robert Burns, Tua Laus? He was writing about a louse because women wore, not only was it cold in church, but women always wore like stoles around their head, their neck, so that the lice would be attracted from their hair into the things. And he wrote Tua Laus viewing that in church from a wealthy woman. In any case, the world today, you guys live better than kings did in the past. In the days of the Greeks, most of the people we're talking about owned property, Socrates was a sculptor. Plato was a book slave, but ended up getting freedom and becoming a teacher, a lecturer. Aristotle was probably self-independently wealthy, So these people did not have to toil for their subsistence. And these were the people that were the warriors and fighters in their society. These people, the free men were the ones who were expected when they were young to learn to be warriors and did not become men and could not marry or own businesses until they were 30, right? In their culture. So they not only were dedicated to their culture, but paid the price that many people in our cultures don't have to pay. And I'm not saying it negatively, I'm just saying that that's the way they viewed their culture. And if we were back there, we would say, well, they didn't have to toil for their subsistence. Some would say, well, they earned that, and then there was all the slaves. 80% of their population was slaves, mostly women, because men were harder to control. Women were very easy to keep as slaves for lots of reasons. But this is their culture. So the view is that if you had to toil for your subsistence, if you were what we would probably call lower middle class to poor, that is a negative. Now, I'm not going to go so far to say that it's a negative of evil. I don't think any Greek person would say it's evil. They would say it is porneos, meaning hurtful. So when we see the word porneos, I'm not going to say it means, i.e., evil. Anguish, I'll give you that, okay. I'm not going to say it's calamity. It doesn't cause calamity. It could, well, calamity. So I have to work for my subsistence. I guess it will be a calamity to a person who didn't have to before. I mean, if Paris Hilton had to work for a living, right, that would be terrible for her because she wouldn't have her, whatever. But anyway, my point is that when we see this word, hurtful is probably a better view of it. But if you know where it comes from, you get it. But do you see why the writers, well, I'm going to say that. The translators the translators drew us a picture that I don't think is a proper picture. But we'll see it in context, right? This other word is probably the most important word in the New Testament. Pistos. Pistos comes from, I got it right there, Pitheo. Pitho. Pitho means to convince. This is a verb. To convince by logos. To convince by logos. And we are reading a logos to tell us, right? So a pitheo is to convince by logos. Pistos means to have been convinced. This is the word that unfortunately we translate all the time as faith. As faith. And if you look at what, okay, this is the number one, it says number one, persuasion. Credence, and they say i.e., that is, credence, moral conviction of religious truth, truthiness of God or religious teacher, especially reliance on Christ for salvation, abstractly, consistency as such profession, by extension, the system of religious gospel truth itself. Translated by the King James is assurance, belief, faith, and fidelity. But the word is from pitho, which means to convince by argument. To convince by argument. Now, what do we know about the Greeks? Did the Greeks just believe? No way! These are the most non-just believe folks in the world, okay? They're like Missouri people. The show me state, right? But except it's saying show me, what would they say? Convince me. That's why when Paul was on Mars Hill, which I love, this is the most beautiful analogy in the New Testament. It is super important, but we only get it really one time written quite like this. But it says, 1/3 pistis. One third were convinced, right? 1/3 said, I want to hear another logos. I want to hear more about this. And 1/3 said, I'm not convinced. However you want to put it, I don't care what the theological implications of this is. I'm telling you what the Greek says. And I'm telling you what the Greek society believed. And guess what? What happened when the Greeks were convinced? What happened?
they
would be a part of that call, or that
They'd spread the
organization.
message.
Yeah, they were convinced. It's like you, if I convinced you of something, whatever it was, that a movie was a great movie, what would you do?
Go see it.
You go see it, and you tell people about it, right? You say, well, this is a great movie, I love this movie, I want to go see it. They were convinced. They were convinced so much that what do we get out of it? We got Western civilization. We got Christianity when it really was teen hodos. Remember, we're teen hodos, right? We got all kinds of amazing benefits. We got the space program out of it, for goodness sakes. You know that, right? The space program, because Western civilization is grounded in two great things. It's grounded in the law, the Hebraic view and law, mixed with the Greek logic, the Greek logic, which is the historical method, the scientific method, and logic. Because of that, we have Western civilization. We went to the moon. I don't know if we'll ever go to the moon again because we're rejecting Greek and Western civilization. But, yeah, you're not going to get anywhere by meditating on a mountain. I guarantee you. I guarantee you. You can meditate all you want, but it is not going to build rocket ships or airplanes or sewer systems. The Romans realized that, right? So you can meditate, go ahead. I tell people, don't meditate, do something. Become an engineer, scientist, teacher. I'm not disparaging professions. I'm just saying Western civilization brings us to where we are, from music to writing to engineering to science, okay? You don't get there. Well, how many monumental classics of science fiction or fiction have you read in Islam? Well, you're all quiet. Why is that? How many great pieces of Chinese literature have you read? Now, there's the Tao and the Confucian. I've read Confucius and Tao. Not recommended. It's if you can get to it, I'll give you a prize. The Shinto writings, modern Japanese getting there. Guess what they accepted?
Logic.
Western civilization, logic. Yeah.
Military study the rules of war or something.
Sun Tzu.
Oh, Sun Tzu. Yeah. Sun Tzu is great. Sun Tzu is a very applicable thing. And here you see the reason. Okay, if you ever ask yourself, I guess I'll take a second for this. I talked about this in my previous class, one of the classes we did about a moral compass or whatever, or knowing truth. But one of the things that the Chinese invented gunpowder. They invented the printing press.
Paper.
They invented paper. They invented all kinds of really cool stuff, including noodles, right? They invented all. Why didn't it stick? What is the main reason why it didn't stick? There's two reasons. It's actually the same reason overall, but there's two reasons.
They collapsed in on themselves, they closed themselves off, isolated.
They're an isolated culture, but that's not really, the problem wasn't the isolation from other cultures. The isolation was the culture in itself, because they were a feudal culture. They were a feudal culture all the way up. They were a feudal culture even with Mao. Even Mao Zedong, they're a feudalist culture right now. A feudalist culture, who's the guys that are on top?
Feudal lord.
The Communist Party member, right? If you're a Communist Party member in Communist China, you are on the top, and you're probably a millionaire. The average person is not a Communist Party member. That's the same thing true of USSR. When you have an elite party structure, you have no markets, number one. And number two, it doesn't get to the people. In our culture, what happened when they invented the printing press? Who was buying the printing? You know this is Martin Luther-esque, right? Matter of fact, 50% of everything was bought that was Martin Luther's. Martin Luther was the most popular author after the invention of the printing press. And it wasn't books. Who was buying it? The common person was buying it. The common person in China could not read, could not write, could not do anything except serve their feudal lord. The people who had the power were the feudal lords, and how many were they compared to the rest of the population?
Very small.
Very small, less than 1%. It's kind of like the Communist Party today. So there was no market, there was no way of getting even, like for example, gunpowder and stuff like that to the people. So who read Sun Tzu?
I've read it.
No, I mean, the Chinese, everybody in China who's a Communist Party member who's a part of the military has. I've read it because I'm a military guy. I bet you $10 more people have read Sun Tzu in the Western world than ever read it in the world of the East. The reason is because it is available to us to the lowest denominator, and most of our people are literate. That may be changing the United States of America, but in general, most people are literate, although they can't read their bill or figure out most stuff, or a Bible even today. But culturally, we have been very literate from the bottom to the top. And what happens in a segmented culture, a culture segmented by class, which by the way you always get in the communist socialist cultures or feudal cultures, and that's the problem. So China's problem has always been it doesn't have markets to create product, and the products never get to the people.
Europe broke out of that feudal system. You know, they were at that level in what's the Middle Ages, but what's it, the rise of the nation state is probably the key breakaway from going from a feudal system to the more Western and European dominance and progress.
I think that it was the rise of two things that really did that. Number one, you had the middle class coming into the marketplace, the guilds and the guild thing, which was a negative really for production, but gave a lot to the average person. Plus the idea of Christianity. Christianity, it took a long time for Christianity to really grasp hold, but what does Christianity say? All are equal. Men, women, slave, free, right? And a feudal society is literally a society with slaves and a society with slaveholders or rulers, right? And so once Christianity took hold, we saw the destruction, we saw the rise in the middle class, which means markets, means people had money, the average person had money, and that began to destroy and shift the society.
One other thing, I'll just throw it out there, the plague probably had a lot to do with it, because now all of a sudden you had a shortage of labor, and innovation had to come. It had to happen. You had to think of other ways to do things, because you could not, we're not enough people anymore. We had a surplus of people to wipe out a third of the population, and all of a sudden you have things like the printing press spring up. You got the age of enlightenment come roaring in, because it had to.
I don't disagree with what your statement is. However, let me put it to you this way. Were there plagues in the East and in the Middle Eastern areas?
Sure.
Why did no one record them or care about them?
Because it was normal.
Not only was it normal, it was the peasants. So if you're a lord, the only people who can read and write are the lords, right, the head of their culture and society. So if you're part of that culture and society, you're isolated from the people. If 1 million peasants die, do you care?
$1 million less to feed.
Well, a million less producing.
I know there's
There's 1 million less producing, so what then do I have to do? I'd have to talk to Sun Tzu. Because Sun Tzu, now I go to war to take the other people. Now I just spread the plague. But they didn't care, and you can read about them. If you go back and look at Chinese literature or Japanese literature or Korean literature, I'd say this though. They did with literature what the Egyptians did with the hieroglyphics. What the Egyptians did is they were papyrus based, and they did a lot of papyrus stuff. So a lot of the papyrus went away too. It's just they wrote hieroglyphics on stone. It's hard to get rid of stone. So we see the evidence of where they defaced. So we know what they did is they destroyed the papyrus from the previous dynasty, but they also they tried to destroy and wipe out the monuments to them, right? Well, guess what? How many stone hieroglyphic stuff is there in China? Almost zero. What did they write on? Paper. So when they wanted to wipe out the previous dynasty, they just burned the paper. That happened to a lot of Confucius writings. There's a lot of Confucian writings and Taoist writings that were destroyed because the next dynasty said, we don't agree with his position, burn them all. And they did. And guess what? When you have a manuscript and the average manuscript is 3, and you burn 3, you don't have any more. So there is there's huge things going on here. There's differences in cultures and societies that lead you to where you are. And I tell you what, I'll pick Christianity any day. Christianity, there are no faults in real Christianity. It's not a religion. It's a historical thing. But, you know, the excesses and problems don't come from Christianity. They come from the people managing it, right?
Toward the end of the Soviet Union, the people who worked on collective farms were each given a small tract of land to produce whatever they wanted to, and they could sell it legally on the market. And it wound up that 10% of the land was producing more than 80% of the agricultural commodities.
That's an absolutely true statement, and I remember that. Somebody, I hope, wrote that down. I mean, wrote that down in terms of a couple of articles and books and stuff, because that's absolutely true. At the end of the Soviet Union, they began to give portions, small portions of the farm. You know, they had huge tracts, right? And the little tiny farms, the little pieces, were producing more than the whole huge collective farms. Amazing, isn't it? What human markets and capitalism will do. Just saying. Anyway, we're in Hebrews, and we're looking at law in Hebrews. And if you remember the previous one, let me remind you, let's see, we're at 21, but I hate to have to break it up this way, because this is kind of the way we're trying to understand it in the Greek. So, 17, I'm going to read just the NIV. And then he adds, their sins and lawless acts will remember no more. And 18, and where these have been forgiven, there is no longer any sacrifice for sin, just to remind you. And 19, therefore, brothers, since we have confidence to enter the most holy place by the blood of Jesus. And then 20, by a new and living way opened for us through the curtain, that is his body. And I remind you, literally, it says, literally, in the Greek, this is my translation of the literal Greek, a hodos, a way, hodos, recently sacrificed, and a living hodos, which he made fresh for us through entering the veil in the temple. That way is his own flesh. Because right now, the argument, we have an argument going on. We have a logos to tell us, but we have a little problem. And the little problem is this. There's a multiple kind of problems here. The number one problem that they have is, how do you worship God? How do you worship Christ? How are you supposed to do it? In the temple, what they had is they had the 5 sacrifices. The 5 sacrifices were the ascension sacrifice, the sin and guilt sacrifice, the pre-sacrifice, and the thanksgiving sacrifice. It says in the Mishnah, in the Talmud, it says, in the age of the Messiah, the only sacrifice that is necessary is the Thanksgiving sacrifice. And by the way, that is a mirror of Isaiah, and I didn't dig them up, but if you go look in the Old Testament, you're going to find that it says very precisely that in the Messianic era, the Thanksgiving sacrifice is the only sacrifice that is necessary. So, did you hear what I said? Is it optional?
Necessary.
It's necessary. It is necessary. There's another thing that is necessary. There is the 1, 2, and 3. 1, 2, 3. And I write it in this order. There is cleanliness. We don't care much about cleanliness, but we should. But there is cleanliness. This Old Testament stuff. There's cleanliness. There is anomia. And there is harmatia. Miss the mark. This is miss the mark, and this is breaking the law. If I unintentionally broke the law, I had 2 ways of handling it. Sin or guilt. One was for intentional, and one was for, well, One was for known and one's for unknown. But we know all anomia is intentional. I just don't whip out my .45 and bang, kill Brett and go, oh, that was unintentional. Actually, you could kind of in their worldview. But you know why, right?
Pathos.
Yeah, pathos, fate, fate. Oh man, fate. God kept trying to help the Jews, the Hebrews, out of the view of fate. But fate is a view, by the way, if you want to do some comparative analysis of cultures. What is the #1 view of most Eastern cultures that have not been westernized? What is affecting your whole world? Fate. Anyone who knows these cultures knows you are fated within those cultures. If you're born wealthy, if you're born into a rich group, you are fated. And it's only, why do you think they have so many suicides? Because they have accepted Western culture, and Western culture says, you can be as dumb as a rock, but if you study really hard, which this is true, I was thinking about this today. You can be as dumb as a rock, but if you study really hard, you can make up for your dumbness. You know, you may be middle, but you can be a theoretical physicist if you study hard enough, right? You may not have you may have to work at figuring stuff out, but you can get there. And when people have accepted Western philosophy, they have accepted that view. That is the view. Yes, ma'am.
I think that in poor cultures that may be a thought anyway. My grandfather, who emigrated from Germany when he was, I don't know, a teenager, said in Cleveland, only in Cleveland, we wore scarves on our heads, you know, anytime the wind was blowing. And we called them babushkas, and he hated that. He said, I came to this country so that my children and my children's children would not be peasants. He said, I knew that I would remain a peasant if I stayed in Germany. So there is that thought process even in poor people in a westernized country, I think.
You are absolutely correct. When I lived in Germany, although in modern Europe today, they have accepted, okay, Western civilization is the only one who really did this, who really forced this on people. But when I was in Germany, just because I was an officer, I was respected at a very high level just because of an officer. United States, you said, I don't care. You're some officer dude, right? But in Germany, it shows that you're at a very high level. Now, they do they in Germany today would say if I work hard enough, right? But a lot of it is the state. You know, they have the educational system in Germany, they track you. When you're in kindergarten, they track you. And they look at you and say, you know, you're going to go to the university. You're not. You're going to be a farm worker. You're going to work in a factory. I'm sorry, you may be the smartest kid. You may blossom when you're in junior high school or high school, but guess what? You're going to be you'll be shoveling manure. I'm not kidding. That is literally how they do it. I knew a guy who was tracked in Australia. They do tracking in Australia. They do tracking in a lot of countries, European countries, they track. The guy who was tracked in Australia, he was put in the lowest class. He came to the United States, went to college, got a master's degree and a PhD. He's teaching at major universities. Again, you can be a middle-of-the-road intelligence, and yet if you work really hard, in our view, and this is the Christian worldview, the Christian worldview is you are not fated. But the worldview from the past, the animism, the view of animism, it comes out of religion. And so the Greeks believed they were fated. So that's absolutely right. The problem that we have now, though, for the Hebrews, is the Hebrews want to know, how can we worship God? And the biggest problem is, why can't they get to the Thanksgiving sacrifice?
Because it was the the last one and all the others needed to be done first.
Well, that's absolutely true. The other problem, though, is Jerusalem. I have postulated that this comes from after. This is greater about 70 A.D. I think you can really see it within the context of the writing and within the context of the argument. It's a very complex argument about Christianity. But if it's even close, what happened in 70 A.D.? Yeah, here's Jerusalem and the temple's gone. And so the Galil, there's no temple. Now the Essenes have a temple, but what happened to the Essenes? You ever heard of, what's that place, Masada? Masada? What happened to the Essenes in Masada?
Eventually the Romans got them.
They killed them.
They killed themselves, right? And they were under
Yeah,
siege.
they committed suicide under siege. But they were going to die anyway, and Romans love to kill you. How do Romans like to kill you?
Crucified.
On a cross, and it ain't very happy, so they decided to kill themselves. Masada, the Essenes were toast. So the Essene temple, which was an illegal temple, right, is gone. Babylon, oh, Parthians, Scythians, no way, you can't go there. Even though there's a lot of Jews there, there ain't no lot of teen hodos there, there's issues. So, and by the way, there's no legal temple there either. So you got a legal temple, you got a temple in Alexandria. But is it a legal temple? And I think, you have a question or a comment? Yes, ma'am. Do you have a question or comment, or you're...
Oh, I could comment.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I really think that the temple being destroyed was part of God's vision to show to get them away from that. So to get them to realize that all of these things pointed to the Messiah. Now he's here, he's been crucified, he paid for your sins. It's unnecessary.
I agree 100%. Merrick, see, we have a theological pool right here, and you're putting your foot in the theological pool. I will not disagree with that. I think that is an absolutely correct theological interpretation of this whole thing. That yes, God was trying to point to them. But guess what? The problem was, what did it do to teen hodos? Well, it spread them, but it caused them to go into absolute apoplexy.
Sure.
Because you have Paul, you have the Apostolic Council, and the Apostolic Council said, thou shalt not do what? You won't eat meat sacrificed to idols. They told Gentile converts to Judaism to do, they basically, and I went through this in Acts, if you go look at it, they told them to follow the Noahic covenant, number one. Number two, they told them to go to the synagogues and learn about it. And number three, they told them, do not eat meat sacrificed to idols. What did Paul say?
As long as it doesn't
matter. Just don't do it if it's going to offend, if it's going to be
the
a
faith of
stumbling
a
block
friend.
for
Is
somebody else.
that right? As
Yeah.
long as it doesn't.
Don't worry about it, but don't do it if it offends your neighbor. The reason this was a problem is because if I'm in Jerusalem, can I get a Seder lamb? Can I get a lamb that's sacrificed and eat it?
No.
Well, I
Oh,
mean,
in Jerusalem, yes.
yeah, originally under the Acts, I could, right? But now I can't. There is the only way. How is the only way that I can get meat that is not sacrificed to idols? There's only one way.
Raise it yourself.
No, because you can't kill the meat without sacrificing it to an idol or one other option.
Passover.
Well, there's no temple. Unless you go to Alexandrian temple, and now it's an illegal temple. There's a problem, okay? This is as if, facetiously, this is as if there was no way of getting any bread to do the Lord's Supper and no wine. There's no way to do it. There's no way to consecrate it. There's no way to provide it. This is exactly analogous to that. So, but it's worse because there's no options. I mean, we might have options. We might say, well, let's just crush something, you know, and make a bread, because we see it as a symbol of heavenly things, right? Even though we believe that it becomes the body and blood of Christ, we see it physically until it passes your lips as a symbol of heavenly things. These are Greeks. There ain't no symbols of heavenly things in the Greek worldview, okay? This is all they got. And if Jesus says, when you do this, what do you mean when you do this? The Seder supper. But to us, it's the bread and the wine. But that's not what he meant. They're at a Seder. They're doing a Seder. And at the end of the Seder, he takes the matzah. Now, we have, because of John Chrysostom, we got away with it, and we made it into bread, the matzah. We do the matzah and the wine. But when Jesus stood before that, he wasn't looking at matzah and wine. He was looking at
The whole thing.
the whole thing. Okay? So we solved it. They had to solve. This was a huge problem for them. And how they do under law. This is Hebrews. So therefore we get a new and living hodos. A new hodos and a living hodos. It doesn't just say it once. It says it twice. A way, a hodos, recently sacrificed, and a living hodos, which he made fresh for us through entering the veil in the temple. That way is his own flesh. So the authors of Hebrews is providing us an answer to this question that is difficult for them to answer. 21. And since we have a great high priest over the house of God, since we have a high priest, here's what it says in Greek. Kai, and, having is added, a megas, it doesn't say high, it says megas priest, hieros, epe, over the oikos, dwelling, literally the family of the theos, So, 21, and a priest, a mega priest. It says, and a priest, a mega priest over the house, the family of the God. Okay, so number one, his sacrifice provided the blood for the sin and guilt and everything else. The ascension, sin and guilt, and priestly sacrifice. Because he is not the high priest, but the mega priest. Not just the priest, but I love it the way they say it in Greek. A priest, a mega priest, right? So not just any priest, but the mega priest, right?
Greatest.
The greatest. So even goes away from the high priest, because guess what? Jesus can't be the high priest in ascension through Aaron. Before this, we had that huge logos to tell us that Jesus was a high priest through Melchizedek. And Melchizedek is a Gentile. You have another problem with that too, but that's what they're trying to solve here, right? What's the problem of the high priest being through the Melchizedekian thing? He can't enter into the holy place. He can't enter into the temple. He can't enter into the... He can't enter. But this is where the writer gives us the laydown. Because of his sacrifice, he then can enter the veil. And by the way, who else can enter the veil?
We can.
We can. And by the way, if you can enter the veil, and I think he'll get to this, he will get to this, but if we can enter the veil, therefore we are high priests. And therefore, if you're a high priest, and I didn't mention, the way they could sacrifice, or the way they could kill meat, I think I missed this, I didn't add this in. The way they could kill meat is because kosher butchers, the kosher butcher, I think, happened, remember when Israel was one, and they had one temple, right? And so to sacrifice meat, you had to go to the temple, legally, to get meat. They eat meat 6 times a year. That's it. We eat meat every day. We don't care. But they eat meat 6 times a year. The Greeks ate meat 12 times a year. That's it. The average Greek. So they would go to the temple to sacrifice their meat. After Solomon, what happened to Israel?
Was it Judah and Israel?
Yeah, it became 2 kingdoms, Judah and Israel. Judah was the one where the temple was. What did I can't remember his name, but it started with A, I think, Abinet, whatever. What did he do to solve this problem so the people wouldn't have to go to Jerusalem every year? What did the northern kingdom do?
Dan and Bethel had places for sacrifice.
That's right. He announced that Dan and Bethel are now the official places. God didn't tell them. He just did it. Okay, Dan and Bethel, come to Dan and Bethel, you'll be okay. So they had illegitimate places, but they could do it. Now, the thing is that once you've opened the door, it's like getting the camel's nose under the way. Once you get that, what do the people start thinking? Well, if I can sacrifice meat at Dan and Baal, well, why can't I sacrifice other places? And if I'm going to do it at Dan and Baal, what about all the other pagan altars and temples? So what did they begin to develop? The kosher butcher. The kosher butcher would butcher meat, especially after the diaspora. The first diaspora, the problem was there's no temples and there's no places to sacrifice, right, in Israel. So how do you eat meat? And this goes back to the rich folks. The rich folks want their meat. The poor folks do too. Everybody wants their meat. Meat is good, right? So how do you get meat? Well, you either eat meat that's sacrificed to idols or other altars or other gods, or you set up some way. We believe, and this is the rabbis, rabbis think that this happened, that when they had the first and second diasporas, I think it was the first diaspora, I think it was earlier on in the early kingdom. I'm an early kingdom kind of believer in a lot of this stuff happening. The synagogues, for example, the synagogues, I think, started in someplace before the first diaspora, maybe after the first diaspora. But at some point, because they wanted meat and to be able to eat meat, they invented the kosher butcher. The kosher butcher is overseen by a priest. But the kosher butcher kills the animal in a proper way that makes it kosher. And you've heard of kosher. There are kosher butchers in Wichita, Kansas. There are kosher butchers throughout the world. There were kosher butchers in Greece, in the areas that were allowed to the Hebrew people, to the Jewish people. So the kosher butchers allowed them to have meat that was not sacrificed to idols. Teen Hodos, guess what they probably connected right away with? Kosher butchers. But unfortunately, you don't got kosher butchers everywhere. You got to get it in the Jewish community. What happened to Teen Hodos? What happened to Teen Hodos in Corinth? Remember? And in Ephesus. They kicked him out. Remember that? Remember in Corinthians? They kicked him out. They said, no, you're not following Judaism correctly. And by the way, when they brought in converts, they weren't circumcised. So they got more problems. So Teen Hodos was isolated from the Jewish communities. So again, they had this triple problem. They couldn't sacrifice to idols, supposedly. That's what they said in the Council of Jerusalem. Paul said, go ahead. It's a huge problem. Anyway, a mega priest, 22. Let us draw near to God with a sincere heart in full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled to cleanse us from guilty conscience and having our bodies washed with pure water. And here I want to tell you something. You're going to find that this is probably one of the most convoluted translations there ever was. And whenever you see a convoluted translation, it means a couple of things. Number one, you notice how we keep finding that the words are kind of, well, they're not exactly translated correctly, right? And sometimes they give you, they're not a way off. I mean, they're not super off and you say, well, this is going to affect my salvation. But they're trying to match the problems that the people had in the King James or in the NIV era, right? When really this whole text is about a problem they had in 70 AD. I'm not saying it's not applicable. I think it really is applicable to us. But their problems, the translators are trying to make the problems become modern issues or problems, when really they are issues that we have solved some of them. We've solved some of these issues. The other ones, like for example, the issue of, does this apply to me? Still is a huge issue for people. But the issue of the sacrament, the issue of the Thanksgiving sacrifice, is not a huge issue to us. We've figured it out. John Chrysostom gave us the liturgy, and we all do it. Everybody does it in Christendom. I don't care if you're Baptist or Mennonite or whatever. You're following this in some way because John Chrysostom gave it to us, and the church agrees with it. But let's look at 22. Let us draw near. It is pro-sheromai, to approach, meta, amid, a cardia, thoughts and feelings, alethinos, not faults, cardia, feelings. In full assurance, it's pleophoria, filled up burden. In other words, entirely complete, of pistis, of persuasion. Having is added, our is added, cardia, sprinkled, rutio, to render besprinkled, apo, off. And sunetis, it's sunetis, to see completely. Porneros, hurtful, sunedesis, to see completely. And, literally, yes, and, our is added, soma, or soma, sarx, suke, pneuma, washed, luo, to bathe, with katharos, clean water, literally rainwater, hudor. Okay, so here it is. This is going to be really tough, but I'll give you a translation that tries to fit this. Approach amid thoughts, feelings, not false thoughts, feelings, in filled up burden, entirely complete, persuaded thoughts, feelings, rendered besprinkled, off to see completely, hurtful, to see completely, and body, sarksuke and pneuma, bathed by clean rainwater. So here, I know that's tough. The translators are trying to get through a very, very complex Greek statement. So let me try to give you this Greek statement in a more literal but not a transliterated translation. Approach with thoughts, feelings, not false thoughts, feelings. Completely persuaded thoughts, feelings. Rendered besprinkled, able to see completely hurtful things and bodies. Sarksuke pneuma. Baptized, immersed with clean rainwater. Yes, sir.
Why would they have chosen the word luo as opposed to baptismos in that setting there?
That's a beautiful question, and the reason is because I think that the baptismos had become, we have a little issue with baptismos. Luo is probably a much better word because it applies to Romans, Greeks, Hebrews, and Egyptians. Where if I said baptismos, baptismos is obviously has to be a mikvah. But not only that, we get a kind of ruling here. Because a mikvah is supposed to be rainwater or water from specific rivers that are allowed by the rabbis.
Kosher water.
Basically kosher water. So if you want your water to be the right water, and you don't have a rabbi to tell you that's the right water, right? The Nile is probably not the right water. But the right water would always be rainwater. See? And luo gives you a less, they probably could have used the word baptismos because it is a mysterion. It can be used as a mysterion word. But I think it takes it out of a context and puts it within a pure context of cleanliness like the mikvah would, right? So instead of telling us baptismos, which would be a technical term, they tell us what it's supposed to be. So they're telling the readers, just in case you didn't know, the mikvah is a luo with clean rainwater. You get what I'm trying to say here? So they're trying to separate it from a technical term to make it more understandable to the readers. to those who understand it, right? Yes.
I'm just observing too from our modern time hindsight, looking back on a primitive survival culture, if you wanted a people to live longer, why is cleanliness such an issue? Well, they have no self-hygiene system of social order. By imposing that on them, you ensure that these people are going to last because they're not going to have the disease and things like that. But it just seems that there's a practical side to this cleanliness thing, just in addition to a religious law side to it.
I agree 100%. Now, let me give you an insight into this, okay? I think I mentioned this before when we look at Mark. You know, it says that if you have any kind of, like, bruise, marking, you know, thing on your body, then you are supposed to be excluded from the society. And so leprosy, for example, right? But how many people in that era had ringworm or parasites or stuff like Pharisees? So the only time they noticed it is when it got to your hands, feet, face, right? So once it got to your hands, feet, face, it's pretty well progressed. So you could be a leper, you know. However, in baptism and mikvah, what had to happen, especially in mikvah?
Be naked.
You had to get naked. And the attendant had to see you. So I suspect that in this new culture, like for example, why would a Pharisee want to have like a Bathsheba mikvah? Why would Bathsheba want to have a private mikvah?
No one can see it.
So nobody can see, right? And so her attendant, you know, yeah, my attendant happens to be somebody who's a Parthian who can't speak any Hebrew. What a great attendant, you know. I might have a little scab here, right? But she can't tell on me, right? So there's a lot that goes on in this. But when you go to get baptized or luo, you see the difference? If I go to luo, right, to wash, and in the Greek society, what do? They got naked all the time to bathe, right? But they didn't bathe in pure rainwater. See? This is setting up some really neat stuff. Because like I said, you know, we don't talk enough about it. We talk a lot about baptism, but we don't talk about cleanliness in baptism, do we? That cleanliness thing is just something and I'm being facetious. But those crazy Jewish people did that, right? And you don't have to do it today, right? But we have baptism. And it's good once for all. Just saying. Yes, sir.
What was the translation when John was baptizing? Was it baptismo or?
Baptismo. And what's interesting about John, you notice what it says, especially in the current scripture today, that Jesus says, who'd you expect to see out in the wilderness? Right? A swaying reed? The people were baptized. And you know, okay, in our view, baptism is one time, no other time, right? You get baptized as a kid, you don't even remember it, you just baptized, right? But what was the truth in those days? You went to the mikveh every time a man had a sexual release, a woman had sex, a woman had her menstruation, after her menstruation, before you had teruma. So most people would wait until they went to the temple for teruma, especially the Hebrews, right? Because they didn't have a bathing culture. But you took the mikveh, women had the mikveh at least once a month, and men had the mikveh, well, the priest probably much more, but you know, the regular man probably had it at least once a month, right? And especially before teruma. But John said, come out and get a mikveh. So the people are used to it. So all the Pharisees, like I said, where do you think the Pharisees were getting their mikveh? Their own little private places, like Bathsheba, right? Where do you think the regular people went? Well, to wherever there was a mikveh, right? There were mikvahs set up, but they would go to the rivers. So the Jordan River is one of the rivers that is allowed to be a mikveh river. So what's the skin off my nose? The old John the Baptist is on the other side. He's near the village of, it's in my book, but it's not, there's two rivers with a similar, or it's two villages with a similar name. One is south of Jerusalem, the other one is over across the Jordan. But he was there, you know, he was there. So what's the big deal? I got to go there anyway. And John's doing it, right? And John, right? I mean, we look at this as if it's a big deal. In fact, I wrote it too much probably as a big deal in my book. I should have been more, I should have been more open, but I didn't fully comprehend the mikvah when I wrote the book like 30 years ago, right? My thinking has become more engaged in it. But anyway, it wasn't unusual for John to do that. And we will start, we'll complete this and then continue on. Thank you, Lord, for this day. We pray that you continue to look at us through this week. We thank you for your word. In your name we pray, amen.